Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight we're going to talk about a number of different topics. Mainly, we're going to, of course, talk about the elections and the concept of voting, since there's so much division about that practice. And we're also going to possibly talk about briefly immigration. And only briefly, but of course we're also going to talk about the Syrian situation and hopefully touch on the Ebola crisis and what should be done about that. But we're going to try to get to all that in this show. I usually set out a roadmap for the show before the beginning, and I don't usually have time to get to it at the end, but we hope we're going to get to it this time. Now, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time tonight, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv, and you can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that webpage, you'll find the archive versions of this show, or the archive links. You'll find the chat room, and you'll find the links to the articles as I post them up on BrandonTurbeville.com. If you want to find my the articles that I write as they come out in real time on the websites that I write for, then of course you'd have to go to activistpost.com, the antimedia.org, irrelevantparadigm.com, and naturalblaze.com. These are the sites that I write for on a regular basis. Most of the articles come out at Activist Post, but all of the articles are reposted at BrandonTurbeville.com, and that's the hub for my work. If you're interested in my work specifically, then please go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, the interviews that I do, the archive versions of this show, and all of the other relevant information, and some announcements related to activism or bulletin points. We're going to be doing that in the future, by the way. I'm going to be putting up the occasional announcement for action alerts, basically. If there's something going on that nationwide protests, perhaps, if it comes across the radar here, or if there's something particularly related to South Carolina or the PD area, Florence County, something like that, we'll post it up. We'll try to get some attention in that way. But, also the books, The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, 7 Real Conspiracies, Codex Alimentarius, The End of Health Freedom, all that is on BrandonTurbeville.com. Click on the Books tab and you'll find the links there. You can also find the contact information. All right, enough of that. I mentioned the announcements that I will be posting, and I posted one of these announcements recently, and it was some candidates and ballot initiatives to keep in mind for November 4th. Well, the show is being recorded on November 5th, so it's after Election Day. But just to give you a brief overview of what I posted here, it was Dan Burdorf, who was a candidate for U.S. Senate in Nebraska. He was a write-in candidate running on the Tax Wall Street Party platform. We had Dan on the show. Dan was running against Ben Sasse, who was this corrupt Republican, had a history of sex scandals with underage victims. He was also running against Wall Street Democrat Dave Domina. Dan's platform involved a 1% Wall Street sales tax to fully fund the social safety net and provide true universal health care in the form of Medicare for all. Dan wanted to nationalize the Federal Reserve and use credit-creating power of the Fed to initiate a program of infrastructure rebuilding, national economic recovery, and the creation of 30 million new productive jobs at high wages, union wages. Dan wanted to use the Fed to refinance student loan debt at very low interest, and he wanted to end free trade by renegotiating existing free trade agreements and imposing a series of protective tariffs on goods entering the country. He was pro-gun. He supports parity agriculture, replacing free market austerity and socialistic farm subsidies with parity agriculture. He was also anti-war. He wanted to create a global peace race. And again, as I mentioned, he was running as a write-in candidate. Well, as you might suspect, he didn't do very well in the race. We had the only 4 people were on the ballot too were third parties, but Dan was unable to get on the ballot as a write-in candidate, so he didn't. I'm not even sure what percentage he got, but that was to be expected, unfortunately. We also had James Hinton. He was the candidate for U.S. House, the 5th District of California. He was running on the Independent Party platform, running against Democratic Party hack Mike Thompson. Thompson's pro-Wall Street, pro-GMO, anti-gun, all that kind of stuff. 5th District voters particularly didn't care much for Thompson. The voting results didn't really demonstrate that, though. So James wanted a Wall Street sales tax as well. He wanted to fully fund the social safety net, provide for universal health care, Medicare for all. He wanted to nationalize the Federal Reserve, use credit creating power to create 30 million new jobs at union wages, national economic recovery, infrastructure rebuilding, etc. He wanted to refinance student loan debt at low interest as well. He also wanted to end free trade and impose protective tariffs on goods. He was pro-gun. It was endorsed by the NRA. He was a very strong advocate for the legalization of marijuana. He wanted to roll back the prison industrial complex, eliminate the private prison system entirely. He supported net neutrality. He's an anti-war candidate and wanted to warm relations in the Middle East, particularly between the U.S., Russia, China, and Iran. He was opposed to the proliferation of GMOs and supported a blanket ban on the cultivation of GMO food. He won the jungle primary of California a few months back, which made it a two-person race between himself and Mike Thompson. And unfortunately, James, who was a guest on this show at one point, did not make the cut. He didn't win the election, but he got 25 to 26% of the vote, which is pretty impressive for a candidate who's running independent, kind of a third-party candidate, and who's challenging a big Wall Street Democrat in California, and who had virtually no money for his campaign. So he did better than expected. We also mentioned Rick Strawcutter, candidate for U.S. House in the 7th District of Michigan under the U.S. Taxpayers Party. He challenged Republican Tim Walberg. Strawcutter's platform was pro-gun, anti-illegal immigration, anti-abortion. He opposed the war on drugs. He also was obviously very friendly toward natural health and natural therapies and organic food and such. He's, I think, a natural health, a naturopath, I think, himself. He wanted an investigation of the 9/11 attacks, a new 9/11 investigation, and he wanted an end to geoengineering and chemtrails, which he mentioned by name. And unfortunately, Rick didn't make the grade either. He didn't get elected. He got about 1.6%, if I remember correctly. So all defeats at this point. But we had a penny sales tax referendum in Greenville County, South Carolina, and that was the idea was to raise the county tax by 1% on virtually all items purchased in the county. Now, those of you who have been listening to this show for a long time will know that I am firmly opposed to this damn penny sales tax, 1% county tax being imposed on average Americans. It is a regressive tax that adversely affects poor people. It is a tax on the American people, which we do not need. We do not need any new taxes except a 1% Wall Street sales tax. That's what we need. No tax hikes for the American people. How about a 1% Wall Street sales tax? So this proposal went before the voters of Greenville County. Vote yes or no on the proposal, and it was soundly rejected. So there will be no tax hike in Greenville County anytime soon. Now, I don't doubt that they won't be right back in the fight trying to do this again. So the people of Greenville County who are listening to this show, please don't get complacent. Please don't assume that the next time they run around and try to raise your taxes that everything will work out in the same way, because it won't. They don't give up. So you gotta remain vigilant. So those are the elections that we are talking about here. Those are the ones that we were concerned with. There were a number of other referendums across the country. There was one in Oregon regarding GMO labeling, one in California, GMO labeling, There were a couple others, I believe, regarding GMO labeling, and of course a few with marijuana. I think Oregon was successful with marijuana. They were not with GMO labeling, which I find quite difficult to believe. I guess that is the fruits of the money spent by the GMO corporations there that are trying to defeat all possibilities that GMO food will be labeled, because it's so good, it's so healthy for you that they can't label it. They don't want you to know what it is. California, the same. The proposition was defeated to label GMO food, and again, I find that very suspect, because the people that, if you go to California, you'll know that this is a state that is not very friendly to GMO food. Hawaii, on the other hand, did put a temporary ban on the cultivation of GMO food on the island of Maui. This is important. This is a victory, and good for the people of Maui for voting this. Good for them standing up to the big corporations and the lobbyists and the hipster scientists who want to present it as safe. It's not, and good for the people of Maui. So there's a victory in that, and there's a victory with some of the marijuana legalization referendums that have taken place, although calling it marijuana legalization is a bit more general than what it actually is. But not what we'd like to see, but regardless, step in the right direction. So baby steps. Here in South Carolina, we had a couple of referendums where one was to allow raffles. In the 21st century, you might not think that this would happen, but in South Carolina, because we had a healthy dose of infusion of religion and fundamentalist religion that said gambling was illegal. Wall Street can do it, but the average person can't, because they'll go to hell. There was this ban, because we have a ban on gambling, we have a ban on raffles. So a church can't even have a raffle to raise money, or a charity can't have a raffle. But that's been changed. The state, as far as I'm aware, I probably should confirm this better, but as far as I'm aware, the state can now have raffles, and that's a good thing. What else do we have here? The South Carolina state will not elect the adjutant general anymore. This is sort of the Secretary of Defense, I guess you could say, of the state here. He functions as the Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard, and from this point forward, he will be appointed by the governor. So that is the other change. So I think that is. Oh no, wait. We had county by county referendums regarding the possession and sale of alcohol on private premises on Sunday. I think that passed as well, so that's good. Another step in the right direction. These damn blue laws have to go. They're unconstitutional. So, again, step in the right direction. It's very narrow. That gives people the authority of the right to, or recognizes their right to buy alcohol on a Saturday and then sell it on their private premises on a Sunday. But step in the right direction, I suppose. So that's good. Okay, now 15 minutes into the show. I hope I have listeners left after going through the minutia, but the concept of voting, because there's two different types of ideas here, particularly in the activist community and the general public at large, I guess we should say. There are the if you don't vote, you can't complain crowd, and there is also the I'm pulling out of the system and not participating at all crowd. And to me, I don't know which one is more annoying. I guess one could maybe make a case for the latter being less annoying, but the if you don't vote, don't complain crowd is basically the crowd that says, here are two piles of shit, which one would you prefer to eat? And I'm sorry, I don't want to eat either one. If my choice is Nikki Haley or Vincent Shaheen, if my choice is Henry McMaster or Bakari Sellers in South Carolina, or if my choice is Barack Obama, John McCain, Rand Paul, Hillary Clinton, I'm sorry, not going to choose that. And, when you argue the lesser of two evils, you are arguing for supporting evil. And if you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. So if your choice is between Hillary Clinton and Rand Paul, remember, as I said before, this is the choice between here's two piles of shit, which one do you want to eat? At the end of the day, you'll still be eating shit. So I'm not going to take part in that. That's understandable. So the overwhelming majority of elections is just this description, right? They've got two people. One's a left-wing liberal communist Leninist Democrat, and the other is a fascist right-wing extremist Republican. And they're both owned by Wall Street. They're both owned by big corporations. They both support big government and involvement in a person's personal life. So what's the difference? Well, I'll tell you. There isn't any. There's a difference in their colors. One's red and one's blue. There's a difference in the presentation. One uses neoconservative, right-wing, reactionary politics, while the other uses Leninist race politics and identity politics and white guilt. And that's really the only difference. What do you get when you elect a Democrat or Republican? You get more war, you get austerity, you get a police state, you get all this stuff. So there's no point in voting for them. Stop it. If your choices are made up of Democrats and Republicans, then stay home, by all means. But let's turn to the crowd that says, I'm pulling out of the system, I'm not having a part of it anymore, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to legitimize the system, I'm staying home. Well, if your choices are what I just described above, well, that's completely legitimate. If my choices were between Hillary Clinton and Rand Paul, or Shaheen and Haley in South Carolina, you can bet that I'll stay home. There's no point in legitimizing that process. Don't even go to the polls, just stay home. But if your choice or one of the candidates that I mentioned above, James Hinton, Dan Burdorf, Rick Strawcutter, those guys, and even if you're more mainstream, if you're one of the Ron Paul crowds or the Dennis Kucinich crowds, fine, I'll give you that. If one of these candidates are running and you sit on your ass, then you've got nobody to blame but yourself. I'm sorry. You've got the opportunity to go out and vote and support the candidate who's standing up for your alleged ideals, but instead you'd rather sit home and eat potato chips and watch Dancing with the Stars, or watch alternative media videos, or listen to radio shows, or just smoke pot and play video games. I don't care what you're doing, but a person that respects your ideals and holds your the same ideals as you, gets out, puts themselves in the fight, goes out day after day after day after day in campaigns, the least you can go do is push a button. And if you think it's rigged, if you think it doesn't matter, then what have you got to lose? It's rigged anyway. Push a button. The same thing with these referendums, the small county referendums. Yeah, you can make a difference. Now, I'm not one of those people that says go out and make your voice be heard, because we all know that it's a vote. It's literally the least you can do if it's doing anything. But please, if you have a candidate that represents your ideals, that you really agree with and you think is on the right track, believe me, this is few and far between. The odds of you getting a candidate that actually does that are very low. So please don't blow it by tuning in and dropping out and becoming the typical stoner anarchist who doesn't want to do anything other than talk about problems. See, it's good work if you can get it, because if you constantly sit on your ass and do nothing, things will get progressively worse, and you'll have an excuse, and you'll have fodder, and you'll have material till kingdom come for your radio shows or your YouTube channels or your articles. Well, I'm not into that. I actually wanted to make a change in the world, and I hope you do too. So use it strategically. So the question is, does voting matter? And my answer is, it depends. So now we got to move on. Let's talk about the Ebola situation. Ebola is still in the top of the news. It really is still leading the charge. I guess election day, a different kind of virus is overtaking the country. Lots of them out there. The most deadly virus in the country is not Ebola. It just got reelected to the Senate. But Ebola, all of this stuff is in the media. Deadly disease. It's going to kill everyone. But the U.S. government continually does nothing to actually constructively stop it. But it is getting the police state in in place in order to allegedly stop it. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail. We're not going to do a Ebola debunking campaign, but what I will say is that the people early on in Africa, the villagers who were allegedly stricken with Ebola, were claiming that there was no Ebola in their village. And in fact, they went in and rescued people who were being held in a clinic who we were being told had Ebola. The Africans said no, they didn't have Ebola, there's nothing wrong with them, and they went in and kicked the doors down and rescued these people. Well, the mainstream media would present the Africans as poor, backwards, stupid Luddites. And I think I would give these people a little more credit for that. They know what Ebola looks like. They're scared to death of it. So why would they kick down a clinic to rescue people? Maybe there was Ebola. Maybe they were mistaken. I don't know. But it does seem fishy. Then you have the U.S. government doing everything in its power to bring Ebola into the country. In other words, no travel bans, no flight bans. Just bring whoever the hell wants to come into the country. Just bring them in. I guess it's the American immigration method, right? This has worked so well for us in the past. We don't stop flights, bring people in, bring victims in to be treated. All of this stuff. Then we have the lady, the doctor who had been treating people in Africa who decides that no, she doesn't want to engage in quarantine for 21 days. She wants to get out and ride her bike. Turns out that she is involved in not only the CDC, that she works with the CDC, but she also works for sort of an intelligence wing of the CDC, which is connected to intelligence agencies. So she's out there doing this for a reason. And I said when I went on the radio recently that it just stunk, because I don't believe for a second that this was just some woman who decided to be difficult and then get out on her bike. I believe this is a narrative that's being constructed in order to bring about the concept of forced quarantine, forced vaccination, and dislocation, right? Because what you have is the idea that people who might be contaminated with Ebola, who might be infected, are told to go home and stay home and don't come out for 21 days. Well, what happens is that in this discussion, most people are going to be completely rational and stay home. They don't want to infect other people. They're scared if they get sick, they'd rather be home, and so forth. There are always talks whenever you talk about someone having a personal right. You'll say, you'll hear the other side say, yeah, most people will be rational, but there's always one person who won't be, and they endanger everybody else. Well, what is this? What happens? We have this woman who decides not to be rational, and she decides, yeah, I'm going to get out on a bike, and I'm going to be as irresponsible as possible. I'm going to go to restaurants, I'm going to ride around, and I'm going to take the chance of infecting a number of other people. And to me, it's the creation of a narrative. It's to get the discussion going. Are the rights of the individual do the rights of the individual trump the rights of the collective? And I do think the rights of the individual trump the rights of the collective, because I think once you violate the rights of the individual, you have violated the rights of the collective, and you therefore make yourself illegitimate. So we'll get into that in a minute. But let's assume for a second that all of this stuff regarding Ebola is real. Let's just say that there's no conspiracy behind it, that Ebola is real not only as a virus, but as a threat, as a pandemic threat. And let's say that we have a government that is not either intentionally trying to bring it in or just incompetent. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have a real Ebola pandemic threat and a government that is working to stop it. Right. Let's look at what we can do. Now, I've got an article up called How to Stop the Spread of Ebola Without the Police State. And we're going to talk about this on the other side, but I want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, right? I want to talk about what causes the situations where pandemics and deadly diseases are allowed and able to develop and spread throughout the population. I want to talk about how we can stop those conditions from existing so we can stop the disease from developing. And I also want to talk about the U.S. health system. Now, we're all in that vein, we have solutions for the Ebola pandemic without the police state. And again, I got 9 solutions that we're going to talk about, 9 program points that we need to get to so we can flesh this thing out on the other side. We've only got a couple minutes left in this segment, so I'm just going to hold off on the Ebola discussion and mention that every other week in Florence, South Carolina at Health First, Palmetto Street, I don't have the address right now, but the Health First Chiropractic Clinic in Florence, South Carolina, they do a video viewing, a health talk, group meetings, that sort of thing, and I would encourage you to go out and check it out. It's free. It's free to the public. There's refreshments sometimes, and it's a great way to network with other like-minded people, and it's a great way to learn more information. Also, on December the 11th of 2014, I should have announced this at the beginning of the show, December 11th, 2014, in Mullins, South Carolina, at Coffee Etc. I do not have the address yet. I will get it for you hopefully in the next segment. I will be doing a lecture on Syria. It's going to be called The Road to Damascus, Terrorism and Destabilization in Syria. That's the title of the lecture. It'll be about 30 minutes to 45 minutes of an actual lecture. And then we'll take about 15 to 30 minutes of question and answer, depending on how many questions and answers we have. And, of course, it's a coffee shop, so there will be snacks and drinks available there as well. So, again, December the 11th, it'll be at 8 p.m. at Coffee Etc. in Mullins, South Carolina, and hopefully I'll get that address for you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us on the 60th anniversary of Face the Nation.
Congratulations.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. I want to start with your decision to basically double the size of the American force in Iraq, to bring it up to about 3,000. When you ordered the airstrikes 3 months ago, you didn't seem to think that was going to be necessary. What is this signal that what we've done so far hasn't worked?
No, actually, what it signals is a new phase. First of all, let's be clear. ISIL is a threat not only to Iraq, but also the region, and ultimately, over the long term, could be a threat to the United States. This is an extreme group of the sort we haven't seen before, but it also combines terrorist tactics with on-the-ground capabilities, in part because they incorporated a lot of Saddam Hussein's old military commanders. And this is a threat that we are committed not only to degrade, but ultimately destroy. It's going to take some time. What we knew was that phase one was getting an Iraqi government that was inclusive and credible, and we now have done that. And so now what we've done is, rather than just try to halt ISIL's momentum, we're now in a position to start going on some offense. The airstrikes have been very effective in degrading ISIL's capabilities and slowing the advance that they were making. Now what we need is ground troops, Iraqi ground troops, that can start pushing them back.
Will these Americans be going into battle with them?
No. So what hasn't changed is our troops are not engaged in combat. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking 4 training centers with coalition members that allow us to bring in Iraqi recruits, some of the Sunni tribes that are still resisting ISIL, giving them proper training, proper equipment, helping them with strategy, helping them with logistics. We will provide them close air support once they are prepared to start going on the offense against ISIL. But what we will not be doing is having our troops do the fighting. What we learned from the previous engagement in Iraq is that our military is always the best. We can always knock back any threat. But then when we leave, that threat comes back.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Now, before the break, we were discussing the Ebola situation, and we were mentioning an event on December 11th. This has nothing to do with Ebola, actually, but we were mentioning an event on December 11th in which I will be giving a lecture in Mullins, South Carolina, at 203 South Park Street, Mullins, South Carolina. That zip code is 29574. Mullins is located between Florence and Myrtle Beach. Florence is where I'm at. Myrtle Beach, the tourist destination. So if you're thinking about heading to Myrtle Beach for a vacation, then check out the event at Coffee Etc. And of course, you could find Coffee Etc. on Facebook and like them and follow some of the posts. I'll be posting an announcement for the event soon. The talk will be discussing the Syrian crisis. It will be entitled The Road to Damascus, Terrorism and Destabilization in Syria. It will last about 30 minutes to 45 minutes of actual lecturing, and then there will be a 15 to 30 minute question and answer session. And of course, I'll be there to sell you books and sign them if you purchase them. So go find Coffee Etc. on Facebook, like them, and then go to BrandonTurbeville.com for any more updates regarding the event. So we got to get back to the Ebola discussion. We were discussing what one could do under the assumption that the Ebola threat is not a conspiracy created in a government laboratory brought over here in order to kill people or set up a dictatorship police state, medical dictatorship. We're working on the assumption, for the sake of argument and for the sake of getting these programs out there, for the sake of argument again, we're working on the assumption that the Ebola threat is real and that you have a government that would want to stop it. Now, we don't necessarily have proof of any of those things. We know we don't have a government that really wants to stop it, and we don't we don't know if it's real or not. We don't know if it's a bioweapon. We don't know if it's just hysteria. But we do know that these types of things can very well lead to medical dictatorship and FEMA camps and forced vaccination, forced medication, forced quarantine, relocation, all that kind of stuff. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So the question is going to be for people who pose the other question, which is, what do you do to stop it if you don't want these things that I just mentioned? How do you stop it without them? Well, we'll get into that. But first I want to point out a few things about the nature of pandemics. Now, I'm not just talking about Ebola. I'm talking about a number of different pandemics. So again, assuming that the threat of Ebola or pandemic is real, there's a number of solutions to this pandemic that are being ignored. And again, not just by the government, because the government isn't really expected at this point, knowing who is in control of it, to want to protect us, right? That's the problem. That's what we're fighting. But it's not just inherent in government or corporations or banks or whatever. This is all part of a larger agenda, part of one big spiderweb network. So we have things like travel bans from the affected areas, greater screening at airports, access points to the country, particularly at the U.S.-Mexico border. All of this stuff has been largely ignored until recently. The containment, realistically, the containment of a disease does not entail the implementation of martial law and the violation of constitutional rights. But in this sense, what we hear from the media, and even some people in the alternative media, is that it is. The solution is a police state. And I don't think that that's legitimate. The idea, if you want to stop a pandemic, is to stop it before it starts, right? You want to prevent its appearance in the first place so you don't have to worry about its spread. So in order to do that, you're going to need the end of austerity. You're going to have to rebuild economic opportunity, create access to proper nutrition, promote the progress and development of the American health system. All that's essential to treating the diseases and preventing the diseases. More important, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So let's talk about this thing about austerity. So throughout history, you can look and see that plagues and diseases and epidemics can be traced directly back to austerity, to low living standards, to poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, war, period of struggle. All of these things can work together to create plague and disease. So we've got a number of examples between the connections of lower living standards and the decline of public health. And we've got these throughout history. So we don't have time to go through each and every one. I did a talk called The Needle and the Damage Done about a year ago or several months ago, where these things were discussed in relative detail. So you can go check that out at YouTube. Now, whenever you discuss mass plague, mass disease, epidemic, pandemic, and all that type of stuff, then you're going to get the reminder of the bubonic plague or the black plague, the Black Death. Anytime there is the consideration of an epidemic, we have to hear about the Black Plague. But the Black Plague is usually presented to people by the mainstream media and hipster scientists as an example of what happens to people who are primitive, who lived before drugs, who lived before vaccines, and the basically total fealty to medical establishment, so-called professionals today. In other words, the ego of the MD. But the fact is that the Black Plague had roots in much more basic and still wide-reaching sources than just medical treatment or vaccines or that type of thing. What you see back with the Black Plague was circulating across Europe back in the 1340s. This was a plague that entered into southern Europe through Mediterranean ports, and it actually came from the Levant area, the Middle East, but it came in through the Mediterranean and into Europe. Basically, you've got a situation in the 1340s, and really the 1300s as you look at them, is and it's austerity. Right, you have the Mediterranean basin is dominated by Venetian bankers, Genoese bankers as well, and they were imposing some very heavy usury on the rulers of these areas, the kings, the princes, other types of rulers. And when, in addition to that, they were increasing pressure, the kings and queens were, kings, queens, and princes, and so forth, the rulers were increasing pressure on sharecroppers and farmers, and leaving these people with less and less of their food crops to eat themselves or distribute amongst the population. And this, of course, more of these crops were sold off as a cash crop to other places. So this reduced the amount of net nutrition that they got. Now, when you look at Europe in these times, you see that Europe met the requirements for austerity, essentially. It met the requirements for poor sanitation standards, certainly. There was a lack of available clean water. There was a persistent sewage problem. Austerity was clearly a factor in the conditions of the disease, and so was the overall stress of the population who was trying to survive these times. What we also know is that during the period before, during, and after the Black Plague, we saw that Europe was embroiled in a number of wars, some big, some small, some lasted a long time, some lasted a short time, but there were wars everywhere in Europe before, during, and after the time of the Black Plague. France, in fact, the Europe was, as a whole, under a famine in the years leading up to the Black Plague, and France in particular was heavily harmed by famine leading up to the Black Plague. So when you talk about the Black Plague, a lot of people will also go to the Spanish flu. So 1918, Spanish flu killed millions of people. What you got to look at there is that the Spanish flu came on the heels of World War I, which left a lot of places in the world basically destroyed, ravaged with destruction. There was famine. There was vastly reduced living standards. There was a high use of chemical weapons during World War I, and particularly those that affected the human immune system, interestingly enough. A lot of this stuff got into the jet stream and was carried around the world. So this played a part in the spread of Spanish flu as well. Now, I know there's a lot of suggestions that the Spanish flu was created on a military base in Kansas, and I think that is plausible, actually. And I think there's evidence for that. But regardless of where it was created, we had conditions in the world that were set up, conditions that existed that were conducive to the creation, or not the creation, but they were conducive to the spread and development and virulence of a disease. So you've got to look at these two examples, and there are more, but we're going to look at these and apply it to the present day. Are we in a similar situation today? And I think, unfortunately, that we are, because the United States and the rest of the world is in a world economic depression. For some countries, like the U.S., our living standards have been vastly reduced compared to those of previous generations. For instance, technology may have advanced, but the applications of that technology in most areas other than entertainment and the police state have been withheld from the general society. Austerity has precluded a lot of people from being able to reach those levels to where they can purchase improved technology and have higher living standards. So there's less people living well. Then you look at 1950, we're a shell of what we were. Our economy and our culture essentially is a shell of what it was in the 1950s for all of its problems. So some parts of the world have never had a high living standard to lose, and that would be, unfortunately, Africa, India, to a lot of, to some degree. It's, whenever the West catches a cold, Africa catches pneumonia, and I think that's true. Now, we've seen Africa has been used as a punching bag and a test bed for many different things. And we also have the Middle East, which is in the process of being destroyed by NATO. We've got Asia, which is a pit of slave labor, crowded living conditions, inadequate infrastructure, all of this stuff. So we've got a world economic depression. We're in the midst of that. Now, in terms of the possibility of a pandemic and susceptibility to disease, the world, after all these years and decades of free trade, of globalization, the lowering of living standards, increased pollution, deindustrialization, GMO food, chemical toxicity, these immune system destroying vaccines, geoengineering projects like chemtrails. We've also got a diet that's full of processed foods, other types of chemical poisoning, contributors to weakened immunity, all of this stuff. The United States, and we're just looking at the United States, has been left vulnerable to a number of potential pandemics and illnesses. Now, Webster Tarpley gave an assessment of the health system. And well, actually, we'll get to that. But basically, after all these decades of globalization and the IMF and the central banks of the countries, private central banks of the countries, helping to work with the private banks of the countries to impose austerity done by the government for the benefit of the corporations, you can look at places in Europe also, in addition to the United States, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Ireland, Italy, several other places, and you can see austerity policies there. So Webster Tarpley did an assessment of the U.S. health system, which was broadcast on the show that comes on after this one, United Front Radio, with Daniela Walls and Kyle McCarthy. And Webster gave a pretty good breakdown of what he saw in terms of the resilience of the U.S. health system, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I'd encourage you to go find that broadcast. The first 30 minutes are brilliant, and I would encourage you to listen to that first 30 minutes. Now, the the question of a relationship between austerity and low living standards and disease is not just a philosophical question, right? This is at the heart of the matter, because if you are looking to prevent disease with vaccines, drugs, and police states, you're looking in the wrong direction, because that's not where it's found. It's found in greater standards of living, in cleaner water, in better sanitation, in sewage treatment, clean air, non-poisonous foods, I guess we should say, and adequate access to the nutrition. So if you look at the connection between the reduction in diseases and the improvements in public health over the last 150 years, and you link that to the development of vaccines, you can look and see that the connection between the two has been thoroughly debunked. I did that in my talk. The idea that vaccines are even safe or effective has been debunked as well. When you look at the historical data of vaccination correlation to the increase in public health and the decrease of incidence of disease, what you find is that in virtually every case, the diseases that were being targeted by the vaccines were already declining before the introduction of the vaccines. While the CDC will present, deceptively, I should add, charts and graphs of the rates of infection and death from diseases here, like we have pertussis with whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, pneumonia, influenza, typhoid, diphtheria, tuberculosis. That's on the list. They've got a number of others. We won't go through them all. What you see is the charts showing the deaths from these diseases. When you see the CDC's charts, it looks like as soon as the vaccine was introduced, the diseases had a dramatic decline. But when you actually look at the charts that go further back, what you find is that those diseases were on a sharp decline long before the vaccines were being introduced. So has nothing to do with the vaccines. The vaccines declined with the increase of public sanitation standards, increase in living conditions, and the improvement in working conditions thanks to the labor movement. And many of these diseases were much higher during periods of war and famine than in times of peace and plenty. And that goes without saying, or it should go without saying. So let's talk about the U.S. health system. Right. We have this situation of austerity, and despite the fact that we have such a preponderance of pharmaceutical industries, we have one of the most drugged nations on the face of the earth, one of the most drugged populations, one of the most unhealthy populations, and that's part and parcel with the genetically modified food, with the vaccinations, and with the pharmaceutical industries, and the medical industry, of course. But we also have to recognize that while the medical industry is generally based on collusion, on massive egos, on outrageous profits, and outright killing innocent people, because there is money in killing people, and there is money in making them sick and draining them of all of the money that they have. So I'm no fan of the U.S. health system. I'm no fan of the hospital system. I'm no fan of the medical industry. I don't like it at all. But I've got to admit that there are some positive aspects to it, right? There are some improvements in treatments. There are some developments that have been made, not as fast or as appropriate as there should be, but at the end of the day, you don't go to an herbalist when you have a broken leg or when you're having a stroke. And in turn, if you're having a problem that can be cured, if it's a disease, then you'd probably better off trying the herbalist, because they're not going to bleed you for money, and they're not going to bleed you for money and then let you die of some type of radiation poisoning from chemotherapy or something like that. So the idea is you take the good with the good, and you realize you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There are some developments in the U.S. hospital system, and there have been many developments in the alternative healthcare. I don't even like calling it alternative healthcare. It's not alternative. It was the original healthcare. The new stuff is what's alternative. So basically, what I am saying is that the natural health people need to recognize that medical treatment does have its place, and that it can serve humanity well. And the medical industry needs to get its head out of its ass and realize that natural therapies in general work much better than their toxic cutting and gutting of the human body and their poisoning of the human body. So I would love to see a situation in which both of these two are combined, and I would taking the best from both and expanding on what they know of each. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I mentioned, and I quoted this in my article, the Webster-Tarpley assessment of the U.S. health system, where he says that it has excellent quality facilities, but it does not have enough of them. It has no logistical depth. It is susceptible to being overwhelmed. And I think that's true, right? I do think that we have facilities that could be high quality, and I say could be because you look at the level of staff in a lot of these hospitals, and I'm sorry that you look at some of the nurses and the nursing staff in a hospital in 2014, and it will make you wish for the nursing staff of 1950, because the people that they're bringing in are just unfortunately not as intelligent, not as well trained, and not as caring. So, and they're not well paid either. But basically, our system, we have a lot of hospitals here, but we don't have enough for the people that we have. And that, yes, in a pandemic system, then hospitals can easily become overwhelmed. Now, this being said, there was a study. I was trying to find the title of the study. It's called Health at a Glance 2013. It was put out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And what they wanted to do was look at the availability of hospital beds per person in a number of different countries across the world. And what they found was that the number of hospital beds per person has declined radically over the last few decades, particularly here in the Western world. And in fact, out of 40 nations that the OECD looked at, the U.S. ranked at near the bottom of the list. We were 27th on the list. And above the United States, we had Russia, we had Japan, we had Korea, we had Austria, and some that you might not even expect, right? We had Estonia, we had Hungary, Slovenia. They were all above the United States. Now, Japan has 13.4 hospital beds per 1,000 people in the population. The United States, in comparison, has 3.05 beds per 1,000 people in the population. So we have a very poor performance. A lot of this, of course, as I mentioned, a lot of these hospitals that were built, and let me not get ahead of myself. In 1946, the U.S. Congress passed a law called the Hill-Burton Act, and it was signed by Truman. And the idea was to address the inadequacy of the U.S. healthcare system and work toward the goal of having 4.5 beds per 1,000 people. And these hospitals were built with grants and guaranteed loans. Now, this was nearly reached. This 4.5 beds per 1,000 people was nearly reached in the early 1970s, but then came free market ideas, the free market fetish, Wall Street vulturism, government collusion, and we lost about a third of the hospitals that we built. Many of these hospitals were privatized. A lot of them were asset stripped and sold off. Some were just driven out of existence. Some were defunded. So you can thank the Austrian school economics people for this one. So I guess that unfortunately a lot of people in the alternative media would be leading the charge in getting rid of these hospitals. So in 2014, the United States is below the living standard, or below the standards we set 70 years ago. So we're regressing as a nation in terms of our infrastructure. I've got to move on here. So this lack of hospital beds is just one aspect of how the United States health system is actually inadequate, because we have a lack of emergency medical supplies, lack of well-trained staff. As I said earlier, it's clear that the staff itself, the education is not as good, the understanding of disease and treatment is not as good, the nursing staff is inferior to that what we had 60, 70 years ago. American doctors are inferior. They are trained as soldiers of the pharmaceutical companies. They have niche specialities, and quite frankly, their egos are so big that it's borderline a mental illness for many of these guys. And I think a lot of them actually do have a severe case of narcissism, which is dangerous. And that's drilled into them in medical school. So this is an example of an inadequacy here. And also a reliance solely on pharmaceuticals and surgeries, right? This is a fundamental misunderstanding of many areas of nutrition. You've got that poorly trained staff and practitioners, and a system that's restricted to the wealthy. If you want good health treatment, you got to be wealthy, or you got to have great insurance, and by that I mean wealthy, right? So you either have the free market or government mandated formulas, or you have these lack of available services, increased wait times, all of this kind of stuff. Whether it's death by the free market or death by Obamacare, it doesn't really matter, right? And we have the situation where a pandemic of a deadly disease would only fast track this disaster, right? This overwhelming of the system. So I've got to get this out real quick because the show's ending. So here's some solutions, right? Let's go through the 9-point plan if we can in the next few minutes. Number 1, immediately halt flights coming from infected countries, right? Political correctness is going to have to take a back seat to this one. George Soros and the Open Society Institute is not worth the health of 300 million people. George Soros and his Open Society can go to hell. We need to implement a halt on flights coming from infected countries. Number 2, secure America's borders. You've got to do that because you've got a gaping hole in the southwestern part of the country where people are coming in. Yes, bringing disease, because that's what happens when people are put in very poor conditions, put on cattle cars or walking across the desert to come across the desert. It's not their fault. Personally, they're looking for a better future, but it's not our responsibility. And we can't have this many people coming in that we can't assimilate, we can't support, and that we're going to use as second-class citizen to work for low wages. So secure America's borders. We got to keep people coming in who may be bringing in this type of pandemic. And I know that's not politically correct either. It's a little more politically correct to say halt the flights coming in from Africa, but we need to close these borders. I've been to England. I've seen what immigration has done to them, and I guess I'll get on that next week. Number 3, forget the police state. You got to put aside any question of whether vaccines are safe or effective. The idea of mandatory vaccination or detention for the purposes of quarantine or any other purpose is one that should be dismissed immediately. If you violate the rights of an individual for the purposes of stopping a pandemic or handling a national emergency or protecting the collective, you are making yourself illegitimate. And when you violate the rights of the individual, you have made yourself illegitimate. You violate the rights of an individual, you violate the rights of the collective, and therefore you're illegitimate. So that is the practice of a totalitarian state, by the way. Violating the rights of the individual is a sure sign that society has ceased to exist as free, or that it is a voluntary act of taking part in this societal structure. So there should be no forced or coerced vaccination. There should be no forced or coerced removal. No forced or coerced. God, I'll get this out in a minute. Relocation of citizens from their homes for any purpose. So, number 4, if the disease spreads to the point of serious danger of contamination of the general population, confinement to one's own personal property is sufficient. So, if, again, forced removal from a person's home is not an option. Neither is forced medication. So if an individual chooses not to seek medical attention in a secure facility, then that person is well within their rights to refuse that treatment. So if the person is infected with the virus with the high kill rate, and the individual can shelter at home because that's their right. And if they're in need of treatment and supplies and food, that can be brought in from the outside at the expense of the U.S. government. That's right, we'll use the nationalized Fed 0% interest credit to do that. Number 5. We're not going to get through all these things, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to have to go over the 9-point plan next week. We're also going to have to talk about Syria and immigration next week. I apologize. I wanted to get into more than this tonight. But again, ladies and gentlemen, Monday night, Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at UCY.TV. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're